At the results meeting, I smiled. I can't wait for my bonus. My wife, the owner, laughed. I already gave it to Daniel, her lover. Hours later, he flaunted a brand new Porsche. I emptied my desk, but what I did afterward, no one ever saw coming. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Glenn, and at 62 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of betrayal life could throw at me. I was wrong. The conference room at Henderson Industries felt smaller than usual that Thursday morning. The mahogany table that had witnessed 15 years of my dedication gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting faces I had come to know as well as my own family. Kristen sat at the head of the table, commanding the room with the confidence that came from being born into wealth and raised to believe the world owed her everything. I adjusted my tie and opened my portfolio, ready to present the quarterly results I had spent weeks perfecting. The numbers were exceptional, our best quarter in 3 years. Revenue was up 28%, client retention had reached 94%, and our profit margins had increased by 15%. I had orchestrated every deal, nurtured every client relationship, worked 16-hour days to make it happen. "Gentlemen," Kristen began, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to remind everyone who was in charge. "Ladies," she added, nodding toward Sarah from accounting. "Before we dive into the numbers, I want to address the bonus structure for this exceptional quarter." My heart quickened. After the grueling months I had put in, after missing dinners and weekend plans, after sacrificing my health to make those numbers possible, I had been looking forward to this moment. The bonus would finally validate all those years of being treated like just another employee despite being married to the owner. "Glenn has done remarkable work," Kristen continued, and for a moment warmth spread through my chest. Finally, recognition. Finally, acknowledgement of what I had contributed to her family's legacy. "His dedication to our clients has been instrumental in achieving these results." I straightened in my chair, preparing to accept what was rightfully mine. Around the table, colleagues nodded in agreement. Tom from sales gave me an encouraging smile. Even Richard, who had never been particularly friendly, seemed to approve. "Which is why," Kristen paused, that smile I had learned to distrust playing at the corners of her mouth, "I've decided to award the performance bonus to Daniel." The words hit me like a physical blow. My pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the table. The room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the edge of my chair to steady myself. Daniel Patterson, the 34-year-old marketing coordinator who had been with the company for exactly 6 months. "Daniel's fresh perspective and innovative strategies have been exactly what we needed," Kristen continued, her voice steady as if she were discussing the weather. "The $25,000 bonus reflects our investment in the future leadership of this company." $25,000, the amount I had calculated in my head, the sum that would have helped us finally renovate the kitchen, maybe take that trip to Europe we had been planning for 5 years, gone, given to a man who couldn't even pronounce half our clients' names correctly. I looked at Daniel sitting 3 seats down from me and saw something that made my stomach turn. He wasn't surprised. His expression was controlled, practiced, as if he had known this was coming, as if they had discussed it beforehand. "Thank you, Kristen," Daniel said, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm honored by your faith in me. I promise to continue bringing fresh energy to our client relationships." Fresh energy. I had been building those relationships for 15 years, some of them since before Daniel was out of college. I had attended their children's weddings, mourned their losses, celebrated their successes. But apparently, that was just maintenance work. Real value came from fresh energy. The meeting continued around me, but I couldn't focus on the words. My mind kept replaying Kristen's announcement, searching for some indication that this was a mistake, a cruel joke that would be corrected. But her body language told a different story. She was relaxed, satisfied, as if she had just solved a particularly challenging problem. When the meeting finally ended, I lingered in my chair while the others filed out. Kristen was gathering her papers, humming softly under her breath. The sound grated against my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Kristen," I managed to say, my voice rougher than I intended. "Can we talk about the bonus decision?" She looked up, her blue eyes clear and untroubled. "What about it, honey? I think Daniel really deserved the recognition, don't you?" "Honey." She called me honey in the same tone she might use to address a confused child. I thought, given the results I delivered, that perhaps— Glenn, she interrupted, setting down her papers and focusing on me with the patience of someone explaining simple math to a slow student. You did exactly what we pay you to do. Daniel went above and beyond. There's a difference, above and beyond. I wanted to ask her what that meant exactly. What had Daniel done that I hadn't? But the way she was looking at me, with that mixture of pity and mild irritation, told me that any protest would only make me look desperate. I gathered my things and walked to my office, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The hallway that had once felt familiar now seemed foreign, as if I were seeing it through different eyes. The awards on the walls, the framed photos of company events, the certificates of achievement, suddenly they all looked like props in someone else's success story. My office was small compared to Kristen's, but I had always told myself that size didn't matter. What mattered was the work, the contribution, the results. Now, staring at my modest desk and single window, I wondered if the size of the office had been a message I was too naive to understand. I sat down and opened my computer, trying to focus on the quarterly projections, but the numbers blurred together. My phone buzzed with a text message from Kristen. Don't wait up tonight. Daniel and I are celebrating the quarter results. Don't know how late I'll be. Daniel and I, not Daniel and the team or Daniel and some colleagues, just Daniel and I. The message felt like another slap, casual and dismissive. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. 15 years. 15 years of believing that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded. 15 years of thinking that being married to the boss meant I was valued, not just tolerated. 15 years of building something I thought was ours, only to discover it had always been hers. That afternoon, as I walked through the parking garage to my car, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A brand new silver Porsche was parked in the spot usually reserved for visiting executives. The temporary tags were still attached, and through the windshield, I could see the leather interior still wrapped in protective plastic. Daniel emerged from the elevator, car keys jingling in his hand, wearing a grin that belonged on a lottery winner's face. He saw me standing there and had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable. Beautiful car, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Thanks, he replied, not quite meeting my eyes. Sometimes you have to treat yourself, you know. $25,000, the exact amount of my bonus, the bonus I had earned with 15 years of dedication and a quarter of exceptional results, now transformed into German engineering and leather seats for a man who had been here 6 months. I watched him drive away, the Porsche's engine purring with satisfaction, and something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, raw and deep, but underneath it, something else was growing. Something cold and calculating and completely foreign to the man I had been that morning. That night, I sat in my home office, staring at the organizational chart I had helped create, the client list I had spent years building, the strategic plans I had developed. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't thinking about what was best for Henderson Industries. I was thinking about what was best for me. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed listening to Kristen's key in the front door at 2:30 in the morning, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor with the deliberate precision of someone trying not to appear drunk. She slipped into bed without a word, reeking of expensive wine and cologne that definitely wasn't mine. The next morning, she was gone before I woke up. A note on the kitchen counter, written in her precise handwriting. Early meeting with potential investors. Don't wait for dinner tonight either. I stood there in my pajamas, holding that note, and felt something click into place in my mind. It wasn't anger anymore or even hurt. It was clarity. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was seeing my life without the filter of hope and denial. I called in sick to work. At 62, I had accumulated enough sick days to take a month off, a fact that suddenly seemed significant. When had I last taken a sick day? When had I last taken any time for myself that wasn't somehow connected to Henderson Industries? Instead of going to the office, I drove to the local library. I needed neutral ground, somewhere away from the house that Kristen's family had bought, away from the office where I had spent 15 years building someone else's empire. I found a quiet corner and opened my laptop. The first thing I did was something I should have done years ago. I looked up the real value of Henderson Industries, not the numbers I saw in our internal reports, but the actual market assessment. What I found made my hands shake. The company was worth $12 million. $12 million. and according to every metric I could find, the valuation had tripled in the past 5 years, the same 5 years when I had taken over most of the day-to-day operations, when I had personally managed our 3 largest accounts, when I had restructured our entire client service approach. I had built a $12 million company, and my reward was a salary barely above what I could have made as a middle manager anywhere else. A salary that Kristen reminded me regularly was generous, considering. Considering what? Considering that I was married to her? Considering that I should be grateful for the opportunity to work 18-hour days to make her family richer? I pulled up our company's organizational chart and studied it with new eyes. My title was Senior Client Relations Manager. Not Vice President, not partner, not even director. Just a manager with the word senior thrown in front like a participation trophy. Daniel's title, I noticed, was Marketing Strategy Coordinator. But in the 6 months he had been there, I had watched him in meetings. He didn't coordinate anything. He presented ideas that I knew came from expensive consulting reports, took credit for improvements that were actually the result of systems I had spent years perfecting, and somehow made it all sound revolutionary. I thought about the client dinner last month where Daniel had confidently told our biggest account about a new approach to their inventory management. I had bitten my tongue, knowing that the approach was actually a modification of something I had suggested 3 years ago and had been slowly implementing ever since. But watching the clients' faces, seeing their excitement about this innovation, I realized something crucial. Presentation mattered more than substance in ways I had never understood. The pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving began falling into place. Kristen's increasingly frequent business dinners. The way she had started asking Daniel for his opinion in meetings where she used to defer to my expertise. The subtle but unmistakable shift in how she spoke about the company's future. I opened a new browser tab and did something else I had never done. I researched my own professional worth on the open market. The results were startling. Senior client relations managers with my experience and track record were commanding salaries 30 to 40% higher than what I was making. And that was just as an employee. Consultants with my background were charging $300 per hour. $300 per hour. I did the math quickly in my head. If I worked just 20 hours a week as a consultant, I would make more than my current full-time salary. If I worked full-time, I would triple my income. But the real revelation came when I started looking at the profiles of successful consultants in my field. They weren't just selling their time. They were selling their relationships, their reputation, their proven ability to deliver results. Things I had in abundance but had never thought to value properly. I spent the rest of the morning creating a list, not a resume. I had done that countless times before. This was different. This was an inventory of every meaningful business relationship I had built, every process I had developed, every system I had created that had contributed to Henderson Industries' success. The list was longer than I expected, much longer. I had direct relationships with 43 major clients. I knew their business models, their pain points, their decision-making processes. More importantly, they knew and trusted me. How many of them saw me as Glenn from Henderson Industries versus Glenn, the guy who solved our logistics nightmare, or Glenn, who saved us $200,000 last year? I had developed training programs that had reduced our onboarding time by 60%. I had created client retention strategies that had kept our biggest accounts loyal through 3 different market downturns. I had built information systems that allowed us to respond to client needs faster than any of our competitors. Most importantly, I had done all of this while being consistently undervalued and underpaid, which meant that other companies that would properly value my contributions, would see me as a bargain even at market rates. By lunchtime, I had filled 12 pages with what amounted to a catalog of my professional worth. For the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten: pride in my own abilities. I drove home for lunch, something I rarely did, and found myself walking through the house with different eyes. Everything I looked at told a story I had been blind to for too long. The furniture was all Kristen's taste. The art on the walls reflected her preferences. Even the books on the shelves were hers. Business biographies and self-help guides about maximizing your potential and building wealth through strategic thinking. Where were my things? Where was any evidence that I lived here too? I walked into my home office, the one room in the house that was supposedly mine, and realized it wasn't really mine at all. It was a workspace set up for Henderson Industries business. The files were all company files. The computer was a company computer. Even the desk had been chosen by Kristen because it looked professional for video calls with clients. I had no space in this house that was truly mine, just as I had no real position in the company that was truly mine. I was a visitor in my own life, welcomed as long as I was useful, tolerated as long as I didn't ask for too much. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called an old colleague. Jim Martinez had been a mentor early in my career, before I met Kristen, before I got caught up in the promise of building something together. He had started his own consulting firm 8 years ago and had tried to recruit me several times over the years. Glenn, his voice was warm with genuine pleasure. I was just thinking about you last week. How are things at Henderson? That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, I said. Do you have time for coffee this week? There was a pause, then a chuckle. Let me guess. You're finally ready to stop wasting your talents on someone else's empire. The words hit me like a revelation. Wasting my talents. That's exactly what I had been doing, and I had been so focused on being loyal, on being supportive, on being grateful, that I had never allowed myself to see it that way. Maybe, I said. I think I'm ready to explore some options. It's about time, Jim said. I'll be honest with you, Glenn. I've been watching Henderson Industries from the outside, and I know the real story. Everyone in our industry knows who's really driving that success. The only person who doesn't seem to know it is you. After I hung up, I sat in my home office staring at my reflection in the dark computer screen. Jim was right. I had been the last person to recognize my own value, the last person to understand that loyalty without respect is just exploitation dressed up in prettier words. That evening, when Kristen came home at nearly midnight, I was sitting in the living room reading a book I had bought that afternoon, Strategic Career Transition for Senior Professionals. She glanced at the cover and raised an eyebrow. Thinking about a career change? She asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Thinking about a lot of things, I replied. She studied my face for a moment, then shrugged. Well, don't think too long. We have the Morrison account presentation next week, and I'll need you to prepare the client history summary. She walked upstairs without waiting for my response, and I realized she had just proven my point perfectly. Even in that moment, even when I was clearly signaling that changes were coming, her only concern was what I could do for the company. I wasn't her husband in that moment. I wasn't her partner. I was her employee, and not even a particularly valued one. But as I closed the book and headed upstairs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was excited about what tomorrow might bring. The meeting with Jim Martinez changed everything. We met at a small cafe downtown, far from the business district where I might run into someone from Henderson Industries. Over coffee and Danish pastries, Jim laid out a picture of my professional worth that was both flattering and devastating. Glenn, you need to understand something, he said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering crucial news. In our industry, people know your name. They know your work. They just don't associate it with you because you've been hiding behind Henderson Industries for so long. He pulled out his phone and showed me a LinkedIn discussion from 2 months ago. The topic was client retention strategies in mid-market consulting, and several people had mentioned the Henderson approach as a gold standard. What they were describing, word for word, was a system I had developed 3 years ago. That's your intellectual property, Jim said, your methodology, but nobody knows it came from you. That afternoon, I returned to the office with a mission. For 15 years, I had been the dutiful employee, focused on doing good work and trusting that others would recognize and reward my contributions. Now, I needed to understand exactly what those contributions were worth, and more importantly, how dependent Henderson Industries really was on my continued presence. I started with the client files. As Senior Client Relations Manager, I had access to everything: contact histories, contract details, revenue breakdowns, satisfaction surveys. What I discovered over the next few days painted a picture that was both satisfying and terrifying. Of Henderson Industries' 47 active clients, I was the primary contact for 39 of them. Not just the primary contact. In many cases, I was the only person at the company who understood their business well enough to serve them effectively. Take Morrison Industries, our largest account. They generated almost $2 million in annual revenue for us. I had been managing their account for 8 years, ever since their previous consultant retired. I knew their seasonal patterns, their budget cycles, their internal politics. More importantly, their CEO, Margaret Morrison, had told me repeatedly that she stayed with Henderson specifically because she trusted my judgment. The same pattern held across our client base. 60% of our revenue came from accounts where I was not just the relationship manager, but the relationship itself. I pulled up our internal database and began documenting something I had never paid attention to before: how many times other Henderson employees had tried to work with these clients, and how often those attempts had failed. The pattern was clear and consistent. When other account managers tried to handle my clients during my vacations or sick days, client satisfaction scores dropped significantly. Complaints increased. In 2 cases, we had nearly lost major accounts because other staff members had misunderstood client requirements or made promises we couldn't keep. But the most damning evidence came from our new business development records. Over the past 5 years, 73% of our new clients had come through referrals from existing clients. My clients. People who trusted my work enough to recommend us to their colleagues. I was not just managing Henderson Industries client relationships. I was generating them. The deeper I dug, the more uncomfortable the picture became. Our company's growth over the past 5 years hadn't been the result of innovative marketing or strategic business development. It had been the result of my ability to keep clients happy and generate word-of-mouth referrals. Daniel's celebrated fresh approach was actually a repackaging of processes I had refined over years of trial and error. The client presentations that had supposedly showcased his marketing genius were based on data I had collected and insights I had developed through countless hours of relationship building. I spent an entire weekend creating what I privately called the Glenn Report, a comprehensive analysis of my actual contribution to Henderson Industries' success. The numbers were staggering. By any reasonable measure, I wasn't just an employee. I was the foundation of the business. Armed with this information, I began paying closer attention to the dynamics around the office. What I noticed made my stomach turn. Kristen and Daniel had been having regular strategy sessions that excluded me. These weren't official meetings. They were casual conversations in our office, lunch meetings that went long, impromptu discussions in the conference room after hours. But the pattern was consistent and deliberate. I started arriving at the office earlier and staying later, not to do more work, but to observe. What I discovered was a gradual but systematic effort to shift important responsibilities away from me and toward Daniel. The quarterly client survey, which I had designed and managed for 3 years, was now being transitioned to Daniel's oversight. The annual client conference, which I had planned and executed successfully for 5 years, was now his project. Even the weekly status reports that I had been writing for Kristen were being streamlined through Daniel's review. Most telling of all was a conversation I overheard on a Thursday afternoon. I had returned to the office to pick up some files and heard voices coming from Kristen's office. The door was slightly ajar, and while I didn't intentionally eavesdrop, their voices carried clearly into the hallway. "The transition needs to be gradual," Kristen was saying. "We can't afford to lose any clients during the changeover." "I understand," Daniel replied. "But some of these relationships go back years. The clients might resist working with someone new. That's why we need to start introducing you as the lead on new initiatives. Let them get comfortable with you before we make the official change." My blood went cold. They weren't just shifting responsibilities. They were planning to replace me entirely. "What about Glenn?" Daniel asked. "He's going to notice eventually." Kristen's laugh was soft but cutting. "Glenn notices what we want him to notice. He's been coasting for years, doing the same routine work. He doesn't have the vision or energy we need for the next phase of growth." Coasting, routine work. After 15 years of building their business, after generating millions in revenue, after sacrificing my own career ambitions to make Henderson Industries successful, that's how she saw my contribution. I walked back to my car in a daze, but by the time I reached home, the daze had crystallized into cold, analytical thinking. They were planning to edge me out, but they needed my client relationships to remain intact during the transition, which meant I had a window of opportunity, but it was closing fast. That evening, I did something I had never done before. I calculated exactly how much money I had made for Henderson Industries over the past 5 years. Not just the revenue from my direct accounts, but the new business that had come through referrals, the cost savings from improved processes I had implemented, the avoided losses from my client retention efforts. The number was breathtaking. I had personally generated or protected over $15 million in value for the company. My total compensation during that same period had been less than $600,000. I had been earning Henderson Industries roughly $25 for every dollar they paid me. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and requested a meeting with Kristen. I told her I wanted to discuss my career development and future with the company. She agreed to meet later that week, her tone suggesting she saw this as a routine conversation about minor adjustments to my role. She had no idea I was documenting everything. Every client relationship, every process I had developed, every piece of institutional knowledge that existed primarily in my head. I was creating what amounted to a blueprint for extracting my value from Henderson Industries. But I was also creating something else, a roadmap for taking that value with me. Over the next few days, I began reaching out to old colleagues, not just Jim Martinez, but others who had moved on to different companies or started their own consulting practices. I wasn't ready to make any commitments yet, but I needed to understand my options. What I learned was both encouraging and sobering. The consulting market was hungry for someone with my experience and track record. The relationships I had built, the results I had delivered, the reputation I had earned, all of that had value independent of Henderson Industries. But timing would be everything. If I was going to make a move, it had to be strategic, calculated, and decisive. I couldn't afford to look desperate or vindictive. I needed to look like exactly what I was, a valuable professional making a smart career decision. The meeting with Kristen was scheduled for Friday afternoon. As the week progressed, I watched her interactions with Daniel become increasingly open and collaborative. They no longer bothered to hide their planning sessions or speak in coded language when I was around. They thought I was oblivious. They thought I was too comfortable, too complacent, too grateful for my position to ever consider leaving. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Thursday night, I sat in my home office and reviewed everything I had compiled. The documentation of my contributions, the analysis of the company's dependence on my relationships, the evidence of their plan to replace me, and most importantly, the growing list of opportunities that existed outside of Henderson Industries. For the first time in 15 years, I was excited about a meeting with my wife, not because I expected anything good to come from it, but because I was finally ready to stop pretending that loyalty was more valuable than self-respect. Tomorrow, I would find out exactly how little they valued me, and then I would show them exactly how much that was going to cost them. The meeting with Kristen lasted exactly 12 minutes. I had prepared for hours, gathered evidence for days, and built my case with the methodical precision of someone who had finally learned to value his own worth. She dismissed it all with the casual indifference of someone swatting away a fly. "Glenn, I appreciate your enthusiasm," she said, not looking up from her computer screen as I presented my analysis of my contributions to the company. "But you seem to be overestimating your role in our success. Henderson Industries was successful before you arrived, and it will be successful long after you retire." I had expected resistance, even dismissal, but the casual cruelty of her response caught me off guard. Before I arrived, I had been working at Henderson Industries for 15 years. There was no "before I arrived" that was relevant to our current success. "Kristen, the numbers show what we've accomplished as a team," she interrupted, finally looking at me with the patient expression of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. "Your individual contribution, while valuable, is just one part of a larger machine." I placed the client retention analysis on her desk. 78% of our revenue comes from accounts where I'm the primary relationship manager. She glanced at the document without reading it. "Which means you've been doing your job adequately." "Congratulations." Adequately. 15 years of 18-hour days, of building relationships that had transformed her family's small consulting firm into a $12 million enterprise, and she considered it adequate performance. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about my value to this organization," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "Glenn," Kristen sighed, leaning back in her chair with the weary expression of someone forced to state the obvious. "Your value to this organization is exactly what we pay you. If you were worth more, you'd be earning more. It's really that simple." That's when I knew with absolute certainty that my marriage was over. Not because of Daniel, not because of the affair I was now sure was happening, but because of this moment. The woman I had spent 15 years supporting, building a life with, sacrificing for, saw me as nothing more than a moderately useful employee whose worth was determined by what she was willing to pay. "I see," I said, gathering my documents. "I think I understand the situation much better now." "Good," she said, already turning back to her computer. "I'm glad we could clear that up. Oh, and don't forget, we need the Morrison proposal updated by Monday. Daniel has some new ideas he wants to incorporate." I walked out of her office with perfect clarity about what needed to happen next. The Glenn who had entered that meeting still harbored some hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that 15 years of marriage and partnership meant something. The Glenn who left that meeting understood that loyalty was a one-way street in the Kristen universe, and he had been traveling in the wrong direction for far too long. That afternoon, I called Jim Martinez and accepted his offer to discuss joining his consulting firm. But more importantly, I called my lawyer. Robert Chen had handled our real estate transactions and estate planning for years, but I had never thought to consult him about employment matters. That oversight, I realized, had been part of my fundamental misunderstanding of my own situation. "Glenn, I'm glad you called," Robert said when I explained my situation. "I've been wondering when you'd finally realize you needed to protect your interests." "What do you mean?" "I mean that for years, whenever Kristen and I discussed your estate planning or property ownership, I kept expecting you to ask about protecting your intellectual property or securing your position in the company. You never did." Robert explained what I should have understood years ago, that my work at Henderson Industries had created valuable intellectual property that belonged to me, not the company. The client relationships I had built, the methodologies I had developed, the processes I had created, all of that had value that I could legally take with me if I chose to leave. "The key," he said, "is documentation and timing. You need to prove that these assets are the result of your individual expertise, not company resources. And you need to be strategic about how and when you extract that value." Over the weekend, Robert and I developed what we called the Independence Plan. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. Phase 1 involved documenting every aspect of my professional contribution to Henderson Industries. Not just the client relationships, but the specific methodologies, processes, and innovations that I had developed. Robert helped me understand which of these constituted intellectual property that I could legally claim as my own work. Phase 2 was the most delicate. I needed to begin transitioning these assets out of Henderson Industries without triggering any immediate alarm. This meant gradually shifting my most valuable client communications to my personal email account, backing up my process documentation, and most importantly, having frank conversations with key clients about my role in their success. Phase 3 would be the execution, a coordinated departure that would maximize my chances of taking my client relationships with me while minimizing any legal exposure. "The beauty of this approach," Robert explained, "is that you're not stealing anything. You're simply claiming what was always rightfully yours." Monday morning, I began implementing Phase 1. I started with Morrison Industries, our largest account. Margaret Morrison had been telling me for years that she valued our relationship specifically because of my understanding of her business needs. I decided to test exactly how personal that loyalty was. I called her directly, something I did regularly as part of account management. But this time I steered the conversation toward my individual role in her success. "Margaret, I wanted to ask you something confidentially," I said. "If I were to leave Henderson Industries and start my own consulting practice, would you consider bringing your business with me?" The pause was brief. "Glenn, honestly, I've been wondering when you'd finally make that move." "Yes, absolutely. You're the reason we stay with Henderson. The company is fine, but you're the one who understands our business." Over the next 2 weeks, I had similar conversations with 12 of my most important clients. The response was unanimous. Their loyalty was to me, not to Henderson Industries. Several of them expressed surprise that I hadn't started my own firm years ago. "We always assumed you were a partner," said David Chen from TechFlow Solutions. "The way you operate, the authority you have with our account, the results you deliver. We never thought of you as just an employee." Just an employee. The phrase stung, but it also clarified something important. My clients saw me as a principal, not a subordinate. They respected my expertise and trusted my judgment in ways that Kristen had never acknowledged. Armed with this knowledge, I moved to Phase 2. I began the delicate process of separating my professional assets from Henderson Industries' infrastructure. I created a personal email account and gradually transitioned my most important client communications there, always with legitimate business reasons. I documented my methodologies and processes in ways that clearly established my authorship. Most importantly, I began building relationships with potential partners and service providers who could help me establish an independent practice. Jim Martinez introduced me to a CPA who specialized in consulting firm startups. She helped me understand the financial requirements for launching my own practice and showed me how to structure it for maximum efficiency. The numbers were encouraging. With just 5 of my current clients, I could generate more income than my current salary. With 10 clients, I could double it. But the real breakthrough came when I met Sarah Williams, a marketing consultant who had left a large firm 2 years earlier to start her own practice. Her story was remarkably similar to mine. Years of building someone else's business, being undervalued and underpaid, finally realizing that loyalty without respect was just exploitation. The hardest part, Sarah told me over lunch, is overcoming the psychological conditioning. You've been trained to think that your worth is determined by what someone else is willing to pay you, but your actual worth is determined by what your clients are willing to pay for your services. Sarah offered to partner with me on a consulting practice that would combine my client relationship expertise with her marketing and business development skills. Together, we could offer a more comprehensive service than either of us could provide alone. Your client relationships are the foundation, she explained. My marketing expertise can help us grow from there. But the key is making the transition smooth for your existing clients so they never feel like they're taking a risk by following you. By the end of March, I had everything in place. I had identified 15 clients who were ready to follow me to an independent practice. I had partnered with Sarah Williams to create a service offering that was actually superior to what Henderson Industries provided. I had secured office space, established business banking, and even hired our first employee, a project coordinator who had worked with Sarah at her previous firm. Most importantly, I had developed an exit strategy that was both legally sound and professionally ethical. I would give Henderson Industries 2 weeks' notice, offer to help transition my accounts to other staff members, and make it clear that any clients who chose to follow me were making that decision independently. The only thing left was choosing the right moment to execute the plan. That moment came sooner than I expected. On a Thursday afternoon in early April, I overheard another conversation between Kristen and Daniel. This time, they weren't discussing a gradual transition. They were planning to inform our 3 largest clients that Daniel would be taking over their accounts effective immediately. Glenn's gotten too comfortable, Kristen was saying. He thinks these relationships belong to him personally, but they belong to Henderson Industries. It's time to remind everyone where the real value lies. As I listened to them plan my professional execution, I felt a strange sense of calm. They had just made my decision for me. That evening, I called Sarah Williams. I think it's time, I said. How quickly can we be operational? 2 weeks, she replied. Maybe less if we need to move fast. Move fast, I said. Monday morning, I'm giving my notice. 15 years of loyalty and dedication were about to come to an end. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was excited about it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes from finally knowing exactly what you need to do. I dressed carefully, my best suit, the tie Kristen had bought me for our 10th anniversary, shoes polished to perfection. If this was going to be my last day as an employee, I wanted to look like the professional I had always been but had never been treated as. I arrived at the office early before anyone else and placed a single envelope on Kristen's desk. Inside was my resignation letter, written with the same precision I had brought to every project over the past 15 years. 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately. Professional courtesy, nothing more. Then I walked to my office and began the process I had been planning for weeks. Every personal file, every document I had created, every piece of intellectual property that belonged to me, it all went into carefully labeled boxes. I worked methodically, checking items off a list I had memorized, making sure nothing important was left behind. At 8:30, I heard Kristen's heels clicking down the hallway. Her office door slammed shut with unusual force. By 8:40, my phone was ringing. Glenn, get in here. Now. Her voice had a quality I had never heard before. Not anger, exactly, but something sharper. Fear, maybe. Or panic. I walked into her office to find her standing behind her desk, my resignation letter in her hand, her face pale but her eyes blazing. What the hell is this? She demanded, waving the letter like evidence of a crime. It's my resignation, I said calmly. I thought the heading made that clear. You can't be serious. You can't just walk away from 15 years. I almost laughed. I'm not walking away from 15 years, Kristen. I'm walking away from a job that doesn't value those 15 years. She set the letter down and tried a different approach, her voice softening into the tone she used when she wanted something. Glenn, honey, if this is about the bonus situation, we can discuss that. Maybe there was some miscommunication about your contribution level. Contribution level? Even now, even faced with losing me entirely, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what I was actually worth. This isn't about the bonus, I said. This is about respect. This is about being valued for what I actually bring to this company, instead of being treated like a moderately useful employee who should be grateful for whatever scraps fall off the table. You're being dramatic, she snapped, the mask of concern dropping instantly. You have a good job here, a steady salary, excellent benefits. You're throwing that away for what? Some fantasy about striking out on your own? I'm not throwing anything away, I replied. I'm finally claiming what was always mine. That's when Daniel appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. He looked back and forth between us, clearly trying to assess the situation. Glenn's having some kind of midlife crisis, Kristen said to him, as if I weren't standing right there. He thinks he's going to start his own consulting firm. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like relief. Maybe that's for the best, he said. If Glenn isn't happy here, perhaps it's time for fresh leadership anyway. Fresh leadership. The same phrase he had used when he took credit for my strategies in client meetings. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. You think you can just step into my role and everything will continue smoothly, I said, looking directly at him. You have no idea what you're about to lose. We'll manage, Daniel replied with the confidence of someone who had never actually managed anything. Change can be healthy for an organization. I turned back to Kristen. I've prepared transition documents for all my active accounts. They're on my desk. I'll be available for questions during my notice period, but after that, my clients will need to work with whoever you assign to replace me. Your clients? Kristen's voice rose again. They're not your clients, Glenn. They're Henderson Industries clients. You seem to have forgotten that you're an employee here, not a partner. No, I said quietly. I haven't forgotten. That's exactly why I'm leaving. The next 2 weeks were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Word of my resignation spread through the office within hours, and the reactions were more telling than I had expected. The junior staff seemed genuinely shocked. Several of them told me privately that they had always assumed I was a partner, or at least a vice president. The senior staff were more circumspect, but I caught meaningful glances and raised eyebrows that suggested they understood exactly what was happening. But the real revelation came from the clients. I had planned to have discreet conversations with my key accounts during the transition period, but I didn't need to. They called me. One after another, as word of my departure reached them, my phone rang with concerned clients wanting to understand what was happening. Margaret Morrison from Morrison Industries was the first. Glenn, I just heard from someone at Henderson that you're leaving. Please tell me this is just a rumor. It's not a rumor, Margaret. I've given my notice. There was a long pause. Are you starting your own practice? Yes, I am. Good. When can we meet to discuss transitioning our account? The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Margaret made it clear that Morrison Industries' relationship was with me personally, not with Henderson Industries. She had stayed with the company specifically because of my understanding of their business and my track record of delivering results. If I was leaving, she saw no reason to stay either. Henderson is a fine company, she said, but you're the reason we've been successful together. I'm not interested in starting over with someone new when I can continue working with you directly. By the end of the first week, 12 of my 15 target clients had made similar commitments. They weren't just following me out of loyalty. They were making business decisions based on their confidence in my ability to serve them better as an independent consultant than Henderson Industries could serve them with a replacement. Kristen and Daniel began to panic. I watched them scramble to schedule emergency meetings with clients, trying to reassure them that the transition would be seamless. But the more they talked, the more obvious it became that they had no real understanding of these relationships. Daniel tried to take over the Morrison account presentation that Thursday. I attended as a courtesy to help with the transition and watched him fumble through talking points that completely missed the nuances of Morrison's business model. He used generic consulting language where specific industry knowledge was required. He made promises about services that Henderson Industries couldn't actually deliver. Margaret Morrison sat through the presentation with the polite attention of someone enduring a necessary inconvenience. When Daniel finished, she turned to me. "Glenn, do you have anything to add?" "I think Daniel covered the basics," I said diplomatically. "I'm sure Henderson Industries will do their best to maintain the level of service you're accustomed to." After the meeting, Margaret pulled me aside. "That was painful to watch," she said. "He has no idea what we actually need, does he?" "He's enthusiastic," I replied, maintaining professionalism even though I agreed completely. "Enthusiasm doesn't solve logistics problems or optimize supply chains," she said. "When are you officially available to take over our account?" By my last day, the scope of the disaster had become clear. Henderson Industries was facing the loss of approximately 70% of their revenue, not because clients were angry or vindictive, but because they had built relationships with me that couldn't be transferred to someone else like pieces of office equipment. Kristen made one final attempt to prevent the exodus. She offered me a partnership, a significant salary increase, even equity in the company. But her offers came with conditions that made it clear she still didn't understand the fundamental problem. She wanted me to stay while still treating me like an employee who should be grateful for whatever she was willing to give. "This is your last chance," she said during our final conversation. "If you walk away now, there's no coming back." "I know," I replied. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." On my last day, I cleaned out my desk while Daniel watched from across the office. He was trying to look confident, but I could see the anxiety in his posture. He was about to inherit responsibility for relationships he didn't understand, serving clients whose needs he couldn't anticipate. As I carried my final box to the parking lot, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. Not just from Henderson Industries, but from the version of myself that had been willing to accept being undervalued for so long. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Williams. "Office is ready. Clients are confirmed. Welcome to Independence." I looked back at the Henderson Industries building one last time. Through the windows I could see Kristen and Daniel in the conference room, probably trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of the business I had spent 15 years building. They would figure something out eventually. They were smart, capable people. But they would never again have the luxury of taking someone's loyalty for granted while offering nothing but indifference in return. I got in my car and drove toward my new office, my new partnership, my new life. For the first time in 15 years, I was working for someone who truly valued my contributions, myself. 6 months later, I sat in my new office overlooking downtown, reviewing financial reports that still surprised me every time I looked at them. Williams and Patterson Consulting, the name Sarah and I had chosen for our partnership, had not just survived its first half year. It had thrived beyond our most optimistic projections. We had started with 15 committed clients and ended up with 23. Word of mouth in the consulting industry moves fast, and apparently the story of my departure from Henderson Industries had become something of a cautionary tale about the importance of valuing your key talent. Our revenue for the first 6 months was $430,000. My personal income, after business expenses and profit sharing with Sarah, was more than I had made in the previous 18 months at Henderson Industries. But more importantly, every dollar represented recognition of actual value delivered, not charity from someone who considered me moderately useful. The phone on my desk buzzed. "Glenn, there's someone here to see you," my assistant Rachel announced. "She says it's personal." I glanced at my calendar. I had a conference call in 20 minutes with a potential new client, but no personal appointments scheduled. "Send her in," I said, curious about who might be making an unscheduled visit. Kristen walked through my office door, and for a moment, I barely recognized her. The confidence that had always surrounded her like armor was gone. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical appearance. "Hello, Glenn," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Kristen." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "This is unexpected." She sat down carefully, clutching a small purse in her lap like a shield. "You have a nice office," she said, looking around at the space Sarah and I had designed for efficiency and comfort rather than intimidation. "Thank you. What can I do for you?" She took a breath, and I could see her gathering herself for whatever she had come to say. "I wanted to talk to you about Henderson Industries. What about it?" "It's struggling," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "More than struggling. We've lost 68% of our client base. The remaining accounts aren't enough to cover our overhead. I waited for her to continue, keeping my expression neutral. I had heard rumors through industry contacts, but this was the first direct confirmation of how bad things had gotten. Daniel left 3 weeks ago, she continued. He got an offer from Morrison Industries to be their internal operations coordinator. Apparently, Margaret Morrison decided she needed someone with his fresh perspective. I almost smiled at the irony. Margaret Morrison had hired Daniel specifically to get his consulting expertise without having to go through Henderson Industries. She was essentially paying him to give her the kind of strategic thinking she had been getting from me for free as part of our consulting relationship. "I'm sorry to hear about your difficulties," I said, and found that I actually meant it. Watching someone fail is never as satisfying as you think it will be, especially when that person was once important to you. "Glenn," Kristen said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "I made a mistake." "Which mistake would that be?" "All of it. The way I treated you. The way I valued your contributions, the way I took your loyalty for granted." She paused, tears forming in her eyes. I didn't understand what I had until it was gone. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. This was the conversation I had imagined having 100 times during my worst moments at Henderson Industries. The moment when she would finally acknowledge my worth, finally recognize what she had lost. Now that it was happening, I felt nothing but a kind of distant sadness. "I need to ask you something," she continued. "Is there any chance you would consider coming back? I know things ended badly, but maybe we could start over. I could make you a full partner, give you equity, whatever it takes." "Kristen," I said gently, "Henderson Industries doesn't exist anymore, not in any meaningful way." "It could," she said quickly, "with your clients, your expertise. We could rebuild it. Make it better than it was before." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman I had spent 15 years trying to please, trying to support, trying to love. She was offering me everything I had once wanted from her. Partnership, recognition, respect. All of it was finally on the table, and none of it mattered anymore. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I'm not interested in rebuilding Henderson Industries. I'm interested in building something new, with your consulting firm, with my life." She absorbed this, her face crumpling slightly. "So this is it? We're really over? Both the business and—" "The business was over the day you gave my bonus to Daniel," I said. "The marriage was over the day you told me I should be grateful for the opportunity to work for you. I never said that. You said it every day, Kristen. Maybe not in those exact words, but in every decision you made, every priority you set, every time you treated me like an employee in my own life." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside my window, the city hummed with the energy of people building things, creating value, pursuing their own versions of success. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "For you? I don't know. You'll figure something out. You're smart and capable. You always have been." I meant for us. I considered the question carefully. I think we go our separate ways and try to be happy. I think we both learned something important about ourselves and about what we actually want from life. "And what did you learn?" "That loyalty without respect is just exploitation with better marketing." She winced at that, but didn't argue. After a few more minutes of awkward conversation, she gathered her purse and stood to leave. "Glenn," she said, pausing at the door, "for what it's worth, I am proud of what you've built here. I should have said that years ago." "Thank you," I replied. "That does mean something." After she left, I sat alone in my office, processing the conversation. I had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, maybe even a little smug. Instead, I felt something simpler and more profound: peace. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Client meeting went great. They want to sign a 6-month contract. Dinner to celebrate?" I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely, my treat." A year later, Williams & Patterson Consulting had grown to 12 employees and over 40 clients. We had outgrown our original office and moved to a larger space designed specifically for collaboration and innovation. Industry publications had started writing about our approach to client relations and business development. But the real measure of success wasn't in the revenue reports or the media coverage. It was in the fact that I woke up every morning excited about the work I was doing and the people I was working with. I had learned something important about the difference between being successful and being valued. Henderson Industries had been successful, but I had never been valued there. Williams and Patterson was successful too, but more importantly, it was built on the principle that everyone's contributions mattered and should be recognized accordingly. Sometimes I drove past the building that had housed Henderson Industries. It was empty now, with a for lease sign in the window. Kristen had closed the business 6 months after our conversation and taken a position with a larger consulting firm in another city. I heard she was doing well there, working as a project manager rather than trying to run her own empire. Daniel, as far as I knew, was still working for Margaret Morrison and learning the hard way that being given opportunities and earning them are two very different things. I never saw either of them again, and that was exactly how I wanted it. On a warm Friday evening in September, I was working late in my office when Rachel knocked on my door. "Glenn, there's a call for you. Someone named Jim Martinez." Jim had become not just a business colleague but a genuine friend over the past year. His advice and support had been invaluable during the transition to independence. "Glenn," Jim's voice was warm with excitement. "I have some news I think you'll find interesting. Good news, I hope. The best kind. I just got off the phone with the CEO of Meridian Consulting. They want to acquire Williams and Patterson." I nearly dropped the phone. Meridian was one of the largest consulting firms in the country, with offices in 12 cities and annual revenue in the hundreds of millions. They want to what? They've been watching your growth over the past year, and they're impressed. Not just with your financial performance, but with your client retention rates and your reputation in the industry. They want to acquire your firm and make you a regional director. What kind of numbers are we talking about? Jim paused for dramatic effect. $8 million for the business, plus a 5-year employment contract at $300,000 per year, plus bonuses based on performance. I sat down heavily in my chair. $8 million. For a business I had started just 18 months ago, with little more than determination and a collection of client relationships that Henderson Industries had dismissed as routine work. "Jim," I said slowly, "do you know what this means?" "It means you've built something valuable enough that one of the biggest players in the industry wants to own it. It means I've proven something I've always suspected," I replied, "that my loyalty was never the problem. The problem was that I was giving it to people who didn't know how to value it." 3 months later, I signed the acquisition papers that officially made me a millionaire and a regional director of one of the most respected consulting firms in America. Sarah signed her own contract as a division head, and most of our employees received offers to join the larger organization with significant salary increases. At the celebration dinner, I raised my glass to toast the team that had made it all possible. But privately, I was toasting something else. The day I finally learned the difference between being grateful for the opportunity to work and demanding the respect that excellent work deserves. The silver Porsche that had once symbolized my humiliation now seemed like ancient history. I could buy 10 of them if I wanted to, but more importantly, I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my professional life, that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who takes you for granted is to stop being available to be taken for granted. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that decision doesn't just change your career, it changes your life.